The beauty that I've meditated upon through the lens of Psalm 104, and then the pain of Romans 8 and the promise of resurrection, and think that, as you said earlier, the light of the future shines into the present. What changes can we make? And if the resurrection is some great revolution that God set up that began in the cross, and it culminates then, how can I be part of that revolution now?
Okay, welcome to this episode of Dchurched.com. It's good to have you with us. My name's Jules, and this is a very special episode with our guest today, Dr. Mick Pope, who is, he's a doctor of meteorology, and we're going to talk today a little bit about some of the issues surrounding the environment, climate change, justice in the world, and the engagement of Christians in those issues. And perhaps your experience has been one of noticing that the church doesn't always engage with those issues, and so we want to talk a little bit about that today as well. My name's Jules, this is Dchurched.com. Welcome. Well, as I've said, I've got a guest with me today, Dr. Mick Pope. Mick's a friend of mine, and he lives in Melbourne like I do, best city in the world. And he's going to educate us today in all things related to theology, climate change, the environment, God, the world, and everything. And that will all be achieved in 45 minutes or so. So thanks for joining with us, Mick. It's good to have you with us. So tell us a little bit about yourself, what you've studied and what your role is at the moment.
All right, so I'm a 51-year-old Melburnian in lockdown like you, and perhaps many of your listeners. I'm a PhD in meteorology, so I currently lecture in meteorology and run the graduate program at the Bureau of Meteorology. Caveat, anything I say today is not necessarily the views of my employer, or indeed anyone else. So I did a PhD, it's over a decade now, in very natural, or a way of measuring the variability of the climate over Northern Australia, which you can use for climate change studies or just interseasonal kind of stuff. I have a background in astrophysics as well. In fact, my PhD in meteorology was my second attempt at a PhD. The first one was in theoretical astrophysics many moons ago, and before that, an honours degree in applied maths. And I'm currently studying a master's in philosophy in theology, looking at aspects of the Hebrew Bible and trying to build an ethic for something known as the Anthropocene, which is the bigger frame or stage in which we can understand climate change. We might touch upon that a bit later on.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. So your passions are across the board in terms of both ecology and theology and so on, and that seems to be reflecting some of the things that you're doing at the moment. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so I became a Christian, how many years ago? 1988. It soon quickly dawned on me, even though the circles I was moving in, the kind of Christian groups at university, were more interested in your standard Christian stuff about your prayer life, about Bible reading, about cold turkey evangelism. I don't know if people still do that kind of thing, but it certainly did back then.
Only if you're a masochist.
Yeah, well, it's just not. People, depending on the forum, don't seem open to sharing ideas in the same way perhaps they once were, even before my time. But it didn't seem like it. Well, maybe reflecting now, it's not that radical a thought, but I thought that if God was creator, and that's kind of a central thing in the Hebrew Bible and the Greek New Testament, then surely my Christian faith should apply to everything, and not just my personal kind of quote unquote relationship with God. So I started thinking about the relationship between science and cosmology and astrophysics and all those sorts of big picture things, and my Christian faith, and discovered a whole bunch of interesting thinkers like John Polkinghorne, for example, a former particle physicist in the Anglican clergy, and Alistair McGrath, who was a former PhD in chemistry, and then I think he's Anglican clergy as well, and a theologian. And then when I joined the Bureau of Meteorology, someone I knew who edits a publication called Zadok Perspectives, this is 20 years ago, I think, asked me to write a piece on theology and climate change. And I'd already been thinking bits and pieces about it, and then started to approach it as a justice issue, and started, and have been doing so over the past 20 years, to piece together the relationship between those two things. Because, as you may have intimated at the start, it's not something that you necessarily hear a lot about in church. So if you're not hearing a lot about it, you're not reading a lot about it, then you start to fill in the gaps for yourself.
Yeah. Wow. And you've got a podcast as well. You've just started a podcast, haven't you?
A couple of months ago. It's called The Natural Philosopher.
Right.
Which is an old name for a scientist,
right.
Before the word scientist was kind of coined. And it's a podcast where I look at exactly that. It's a podcast on science, the environment, and the Christian faith is the tagline.
Right. So it's kind of broader than just environment and theology. It sounds as though it's got a broader remit to it.
Yeah, well, it will do. I mean, I've mostly, primarily because I'm recycling old material, it's in that space of climate change and justice and so on. But I've started reviewing books, and I'll be interviewing friends as you're doing now. But I think it's all of one piece in a sense, is that climate change science is an aspect of science, for example, and you can't, when it comes to climate change, it's not an aspect of technology alone or science alone, but it relates to your worldview, which is theology and philosophy, and your politics and economics and so on. So it'll be wherever it takes me, I guess.
So how is what we're discussing today, just to get us into this, relevant to people who are perhaps on the fringes of church life, either leaving or going or coming or whatever, but not quite fully in church life at the moment? How is this relevant?
I'll tell you a story. And a few years ago, I got invited up to Bendigo, and Bendigo's got a few thriving communities that do church and Christianity differently. So there's a cornerstone community up there, and they invited me to go and speak at the outdoor education faculty at the university there. So for those who are not in the know, outdoor education is something that they teach where you can take disaffected youth and try and turn them into human beings in the space of a few days, bushwalking and whatever else, which is a whole nother thread when you think about our need to reconnect to nature and how that reorients us as human beings. But anyway, those at the faculty were, and probably still are, stuck in the kind of Lynn White's 1960s paper that said the church, Christianity, was to blame for all the major environmental issues that we have today. And while that's not true, it's partially true. So there's been much antipathy between the church and the environmental movement, and a general suspicion on both sides. But when I spoke at the faculty, and then I spoke at what's called the Old Church, which is an old Uniting Church, and it's got all soft furnishings in now and no hard pews and stuff, and a wonderful community garden. And after I'd spoke, someone came up to me afterwards and said, do you know, or I can't remember now if it was a conversation I had or I heard it secondhand, that someone said, that's the kind of God that I can believe in. And so I guess what I'm saying is that when people hear that, if they have a love of something like the world in which we live and we rely and depend upon, and the natural beauty and so on, and they hear maybe for the first time someone speaking from the Bible and the Christian tradition saying, yeah, God loves that as well, and I as a Christian believe that to be the case, and try and shape my life as best I can around that, then all of a sudden the penny drops for them. They think, well, maybe this is Christianity, it's not just an otherworldly thing, it's not disconnected from the real issues that we deal with, but maybe there's something to this. Or if you've been on the edge of faith because you haven't heard a lot of this, and you're hearing teaching quite to the contrary, you've got someone like myself, and there are many others too, saying, well, that's not the case at all. These two things kind of go together. Then I think that's a message worth proclaiming. And it's not just an opportunity to sell the traditional Christian message. It is taking what people consider to be the traditional Christian message and saying, actually, it works on a bigger stage that encompasses everything.
Right, right. Yep. And folks who've listened to this channel will have heard me talk a little bit about this as well. So how do you view the non-human world then, given that perspective on nature, on the environment and its importance?
There's a couple of ways, I guess, I approach it. This with my science hat on and my theological hat on. Not that they're separate hats, really, but you understand the contrast. Science really does tell us how deeply interconnected we are with everything else. So even the phrase "the non-human world" is probably something that's a bit problematic. But so science will say that we've got a shared 4.5 billion years of evolutionary history, and that you and I are not made up of different stuff from the worms in your garden or the apple or the banana that you eat. They'll share a fair amount of DNA and certainly all of the chemicals that are involved. Science will then, of course, tell you that the 13.8 billion year history of the universe are all obviously tied together, and that we're, to quote Carl Sagan, we're made of star stuff. But then when you look at what's known as Earth system science, it talks about what a complex and interrelated whole the Earth that we live on is, that there's a relationship between the atmosphere and the oceans and life itself and the solid Earth, and all these things work together. It goes back to James Lovelock's Gaia theory, and it's now called Earth system science, to use a more neutral term. So on that hand, it's like there's no such thing, or rather the dichotomy between culture and nature, or human beings and the non-human world, is a bit stupid, because we are of one stuff and we depend upon it. And now we're the ones who are particularly driving damage and great change to everyone's detriment, ourselves included. And then on the other hand, you've got the theological picture, which talks about, I guess, so we tend to think, or Christians can tend to think of a couple of different fundamental categories, and it's like God and human beings on the one hand, and then the non-human creation on the other. Whereas the Bible is much more about, and probably not even in these terms, but a better categorization would be God on the one hand and everything else on the other, which says that human beings are creatures, which then has the further implication that, we're not God, even if the tradition talks about being made in the image of God and what that might mean. But then there's just all these things that the Bible says. So for example, Genesis 2, that there's this wonderful pun in the Hebrew, Adam from the Adamah, or you might say humans from the humus, that we are from the dirt. And, the Bible says from the earth we come, and to the earth we turn, ashes to ashes, dust to dust kind of thing. And then if you jump forward to the New Testament, the idea in Paul of the earth being in birth pains or groaning pains, that the earth will give rise to the resurrection of the dead. So there's you can talk about the earth as Mother Earth in a theological kind of point of view, but this idea that we're, again, theologically so tied up with the rest of the creation that it's we're not shall I use some fancy words? We're not ontologically different in a sense.
Okay, you might need to explain that.
Yeah, I will. So as I've said already, we're physically similar to everything else. And again, to put the science hat on, when you look at the intelligence of chimpanzees or whales or crows, or there's all this stuff now on neuroscience of different species that says, well, we're not entirely unique in the kinds of things that we think make us human. It's more in degree rather than kind. But when you add it all together, you get this incredibly smart, mostly upright walking ape. So it's not just a matter of being per se, but it's our function that we're given in creation. If you look at Psalm 8, that I was reading this the other day to my wife, says, when you look at the stars, if you can see them in built up Melbourne, and ponder for a minute, what are human beings that God should give a hoot, but we're made, a little less than God and dominion over these other creatures. So it's not somehow like we've pulled ourselves up by our evolutionary bootstraps, but it's God saying, okay, I've put you, quote unquote, in charge. Don't make a mess of it. And look, we've made a mess of it. But that we compare ourselves to the creative acts of God. Well, that really does and should make us humble.
Yeah. So what is our responsibility for, I don't know if I can use the phrase now, the non-human world?
Non-human, more than human, other than human. It's one of the phrases in a commentary on Romans really bugged me. The commentator wrote subhuman, which is, language is incredibly important. I don't have the right phrase for it. What's our responsibility? Well, if you buy into the language that we are given dominion, you need to unpack that properly. And one of the responses of Lynn White, I mentioned that paper earlier, written in the 60s, was that people have taken the idea of dominion and run with it in a very negative direction. And you'll find a lot of Christians today will say, well, it's our earth and we're free to do with what we like. But that's not the picture that's presented. And the fundamental shaping or orientation of that account, Genesis 1, is that we're made in the image of God. And what do you see God do in Genesis 1? You see the Spirit of God resting over the waters of the deep, and the deep, the word in the Hebrew is related back to ancient Near Eastern creation myths, and it carries out the idea of this amorphous chaos. And in Genesis 1, God takes chaos and brings order out of it. And, tied up very much in that in the Hebrew worldview was agriculture. So there's this account that this seed-bearing plants are given to humans, and the green, I may have this around the wrong way, the green leafy plants are given to the animals. So it's this set up order in creation so that everyone has something to eat and everything has its place and a place for everything. So if we're not order creating, but instead we're disorder creating, chaos creating by the way in which we chop down all the forests and pump out too much greenhouse gases into the atmosphere and pollute the oceans with plastics and petrochemicals and all the rest of it, you're creating disorder, you're creating chaos, because you're destroying creatures' ability to carry out their function, whether it's to fill the air with birds, or fill the oceans with fish, or be fruitful and multiply for all species, because that command's given to both the birds of the air and the fish in the sea and human beings in the account.
Yeah.
So we're meant to be order bringers.
Yeah. I mean, I find that that whole phrase of having dominion over the earth just got so appallingly used right the way from the 19th century, or even before that, to legitimate a kind of raping of the land. Everything from the vast buffalo herds of North America being almost wiped out, through to the way we just take and take and take without giving back, and don't feel like we're there as conquerors and are separate to the land, is such a profound.
The issue is that scholars seem to think that Psalm 104 comes before Genesis 1. And if you look at that account, it's human agricultural activities a small part of the general way in which God tends for the earth. And so there's this prolonged discussion about rain, which is a significant thing if you're in Palestine and it's these 2 rainy seasons per year. You're not reliant as the Egyptians were on agricultural flooding, so it's tenuous kind of soil and a tenuous rain environment. And there's a couple of verses that talk about bread to gladden, I forget precisely what it says, but bread and wine. And the rest of the account, several verses, is talking about the way in which all the other creatures rely upon the water. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is that if you privilege one creation account, and there are several in the Bible, over the others, and make that your dominant narrative, chances are you've got an axe to grind. And it's precisely what you're talking about, is that dominion account, because then you flip even to another chapter and Genesis 2, and we're called to serve the earth and keep it. And both of those are religious terms. Like serve the earth like you serve God, and keep it like you keep the law. And that's very different language again. And the editors have put the two together, so we've got to read them together. But we've often said, oh, we'll have this one because this one lets me do what I like, even though it doesn't. But we read it that way. And then all these other creation stories or that parallel this say something completely different.
So what do you think our responsibility as human beings is to the natural world?
So it would seem to me, oh, where do you start? I mean,
Yeah, big question, isn't it?
yeah, it's a huge question, but the first thing is probably, so if made in the image of God and God is a creator, therefore we're meant to create order and beauty, then anytime, and Alain de Botton says this at the end of The Architecture of Happiness, he says something along the lines of that any building that you make must do justice to the landscape in which you make it, because you've displaced a whole bunch of other creatures. To live, to exist, necessarily means some degree of displacement of something that was there before, and all creatures clearly do that. And so whatever it is that we build or construct as human beings must be done in a way that doesn't detract from what was there before. Or I think too, to come back to something I said earlier, the fact that the Bible recognizes Genesis 1 as an initial creation account, that all the other creatures are meant to be fruitful and multiply as well, means that our blessing to be fruitful and multiply is not to be to their detriment either. So you mentioned buffalo. That's an interesting one, because that was more than just an ecocidal tendency. That was a genocidal one as well, to force American Indians onto the reserves. It means whatever that we do must be in some way, shape, or form in harmony with that which exists. And you see that in Aboriginal peoples, the way in which they manage the land with the cultural burning and this, that, and the other. What they do is far more in tune with the land. I had this discussion with someone at a conference recently. They were I had a soil scientist and a forester in the same session. I was trying to say, well, shouldn't we, for example, take Uncle Bruce Pascoe's advice seriously and start growing traditional Aboriginal crops rather than maybe rice or wheat so much or whatever, because the native ones can be grown in a way in which is far more in harmony with the land. So that's just, for example, one way of thinking about it. But the other would ultimately be the quite brutal fact that we need to protect the more than human creation from ourselves. And that seems to be the thing that we need to do now. And, whether you believe in dominion theology or not, whether we like it or not, we do run the place. So it's, do we do so in a way in which is conscious and says, oh, I'll either manage properly or manage by withdrawal, one of the two, rather than just let it go along as it does. So we have choices to make. We burn fossil fuels, or we don't burn fossil fuels. And either way, you're making a choice about the future trajectory of the Earth system.
So there's a kind of difference, isn't there? I mean, this is where the language is really important. So if you talk about dominion, that has the idea of somebody riding roughshod, conquering, suppressing, oppressing. Whereas if you talk about stewardship and management, then that has a sense of, like one of the parables of Jesus, a sense of accountability to the owner of the vineyard, as it were, or the owner, who's gone away, that kind of parable, and is going to come back one day. And in a sense, there's something there that's so important in the language that we use. And the problem with language is it creates the environment and the frames of and the frames of reference through which, the lenses almost through which we see this discussion. So if you take the language of salvation and how that's been used to be about getting to heaven when we die, it incipiently or subtly diminishes the significance of this Adama stuff, this earth stuff that we're made of and that we're made for and connected to. So language, right. I'm just saying language, yeah. I guess, is really, really important.
And for that very reason, I've heard stewardship actually critiqued. I mean, there's a whole bunch of issues, but one is to think of it in over economic terms. I think you'll get people saying, for example, that in thinking about how to properly care for the world of creation, we need to include it in our economic systems. So people talk about ecosystem services, for instance. So trees give us oxygen. If you have obviously forested area around a water catchment, they'll give you water purification as well. the plankton in the oceans give us oxygen. You can talk about rainforests being potential sources of cures for cancer. Historically, it's given us rubber and chocolate and so on. So you can take a really utilitarian approach, and then that comes down to issues like, well, we'll tear down this forest and this, for our coal mine, but we'll preserve a forest in another location. But they're not the same, they're not the same place. And that wouldn't make any sense in an Indigenous frame, thinking about country and place and belonging and so on. So even that language is not fraught with danger. But I do like what you're saying about how that does tie in the parables, and it's not ours. It's something that we quote unquote manage until the king returns, or perhaps that sense too of, well, I'm just kind of borrowing this because I've got to hand this land on to my children, and in turn his children, and so on and so forth. That we tend to live like it's ours to do with what we like in the present without any thought to the future. That we're not, in a phrase used, I think in a title of a newish book, we're not good ancestors.
No. And again, that's not depending on your view of salvation, but also on your view of the second coming. If you have a view that this world will be destroyed, and it's all about getting to heaven, do not pass go, do not bother about the planet, then what does it matter? The physical world is less important.
Which is, again, it's not biblical at all. I mean, there's where did it start? I mean,
I blame the Greeks to start with.
This is where I was going to go. The early church fathers wanted to communicate the Christian message in a way that was intellectually understandable to their contemporaries. So let's borrow from Plato, and you get this hierarchy of being from God is perfect and unchanging. And there's problems enough with that view. Did I say too much? This feeds into classical theism, but then it's this kind of degraded order of being until you get to the world in which we live. And then soon people start to think about going to heaven when you die. And the two rejoinders to that, firstly, the Hebrew Bible is incredibly disworldly and an incredibly underdeveloped idea of what the afterlife looks like. You've got the shades or the shadows, the Rephaim in the Old Testament, and which psalm is it that talks about how the dead can't praise God? And then you get the idea of the resurrection developing late in the piece. Then the New Testament, it's all about bodily resurrection, which is how we know that Jesus was not guilty of being the charge of being a revolutionary or a false Messiah. That's how we know that he is the Son of God in that messianic title. And then Paul squeaking in that he's divine as well. But it's also pointing to the future. So, I mean, here's an interesting theological divide. You've got, on the one side, conservative evangelicals obsessing about the bodily resurrection of Christ, as we think we should, but neglecting what that might mean for justice or the restoration of all things. Revelation 21:5, God's making all things new. And then, if you'll forgive me, on the other side, the liberals, those who might read John Shelby Spong saying, no, it's not important that the resurrection be bodily, but then really into injustice and environmentalism and so on, and can't see the connection between the two. So sitting in between, I want to say, yes, it's fundamental to the trajectory of the Hebrew Bible and its understanding of justice being done, replacing, if you will, having many children as a sign of your ongoing kind of existence through them to, no, your individual existence was part of a community too, but as a resurrected individual, but then in a resurrected, transformed world. So to then turn around and read 2 Peter 3 like a stoic, that the world is literally burned up rather than the deeds of human beings purified, and take Romans 8 and the groaning of creation waiting for the resurrection, and the deep, intimate connection between the fate of the creation or the natural world and human beings, it's just, there's a real lack of integration of thought on both sides.
Yeah, and for those of you who are just trying to keep up with what was just said, I have actually spoken about those two texts that Mick just mentioned in an earlier podcast, and absolutely. I mean, let's talk about the connection between what we're talking about and justice, because it sounds like we're just talking, well, we ought to cuddle a few pandas and not put our plastics in the ocean, sort of thing, because the turtles don't like it. Tell us about a little bit more about some of the implications you think of about how we
Sure. I
treat
mean,
the environment.
in fact, and it's not a big jump once we've done that to go back to the non-human or the modern human from that perspective. But if you look at the history of human beings' impact upon the planet, I guess we've always done it. And there's more and more work now that looks at how civilizations have contributed to their own doom or demise through, quote unquote, what we might call now environmental mismanagement. But the real explosion, of course, begins from the Industrial Revolution, when we started burning fossil fuels more intensely, and it started in the UK, obviously, but then really kicks off post-World War II. And so what you see is a rapid building of post-war economies through the burning of fossil fuels and the concomitant manufacturing of plastics and all manner of other things, right? But that happened primarily in what we might call the Western world, or the developed world, or the minority world, however you want to label it. So United States, the UK, much of Europe, and by extension Australia, etc., over and against China, who came to the piece late, and the Pacific and indigenous peoples around the planet who weren't the driving force behind that. And now if you think about the impacts that that's had in the present on sea level rise in the Pacific, that the people there are threatened with losing their homes beneath the waves, and they've contributed, a minuscule amount to the greenhouse gases that have driven that sea level rise. Or you think about what's happened in, say, in India, where climate change driven by Western development has disrupted the Indian monsoon, and it can often be late and less total rainfall, but more catastrophic rainfall events. And that leads to localized heavy flooding and the silting up of agricultural land. And therefore the men go off to the big cities to work, and the women are left behind to be predated on by people involved in the slave industry. Or if you think about the role that a 6-year drought played in Syria as one of the drivers behind the civil unrest, which led to a flood, pardon the pun, of people seeking asylum in the West. So there are so many different issues, and particularly issues that some Christians have cared about, like abolition of slavery and refugees and all manner of other things. And they all come down to the activities of people in the West. Or indeed, as we just talked about, the future generations, so the Greta Thunbergs of the world and her cohort have woken up to the fact that the world they're going to inherit is going to be a hot mess, to coin a phrase. So all of these things are justice issues, because to cast it in the frame of the parable of the Good Samaritan, if people are familiar with that, we're not being good neighbors to people now or into the future. So climate change and other aspects of the Anthropocene, they intersect a whole suite of justice issues and help magnify them, and indeed will kind of overwhelm them in time if let loose.
You've mentioned to me in the past certain views about ways of using something like the Good Samaritan in this respect. So what do you do with that that's a little bit different? How do you talk about this?
So people are probably familiar with the idea of the parable of the Good Samaritan. You get a man is beset by bandits, not just thieves or robbers, but by revolutionaries, kind of Robin Hoods of the day, and two religious dignitaries walk past and don't want to get their hands dirty, don't want to get involved for the various reasons that you might say ritual purity or whatever, who would map directly today on conservatives who say social justice is not part of the gospel, which is patent nonsense in my view. And then you get a Samaritan who's the kind of, I always struggle, what's the best illustration of this, but a Samaritan helping a Jewish person would be like an African-American defending, a Trump supporter. And this happened in recent protests in the United States, or a member of the KKK, or a Palestinian defending a Jew, or a Tutu defending a Hutsi or coming to their aid. And taking this person, and at great personal cost, for their medical bills to restore them to their original dignity as a human being. And so on the one hand, we're not bad at restorative justice. If there's a natural disaster, there's a tsunami goes through Sri Lanka, we'll open our wallets and say, here, give funds, not so we continue to give funds, but so that you can get back on your feet. And that's very much part of the Australian way, isn't it, of giving out a helping hand. But one of the things that sits behind the parable, and I know it's not necessarily Jesus' original point, was the reason that you had bandits in the first place, in the first century world in Palestine, was that when Rome marched in to a new territory, their armies slaughtered your armies, crucified anyone who would dare oppose you, and then heavily taxed the populace to fund their armies and the very rich and opulent lifestyle that they lived back in Rome, the Senate and Caesar and his family and so on. And if you read the book of Revelation, there's a statement, I forget the chapter and verse, that savages the merchants of the day for making money off people's misery and the luxury and the opulence of Rome of the day. On top of that, to run the temple, which itself had become a corrupt system in Jerusalem, there was a temple tax as well. So if you were a farmer and you had a bad crop and you had to borrow money and then you had another failure, under all that taxation pressure, it was very easy to fall either into, you were a day worker, like in so many of Jesus' parables, or you fell into banditry because it was a way to make ends meet. So you became the local Robin Hood. And these people were incredibly popular with the locals at the time. So while I think there's a very strong command for Christians and those in the church, and indeed everyone, to say we're going to give a helping hand to people when they suffer, whether or not it's their homes disappearing beneath the waves or their crops have failed because of heat waves or whatever else to do with climate change, if you do nothing about the underlying injustices implicit in the system that arises, these things will keep happening. And for us in the West, it's dealing fundamentally with the drivers of climate change, the fossil fuel industry, the agricultural kind of machinery, and some might say the eating of meat in such large quantities that drives land clearing, and all the other things, rampant consumerism, the manufacture of plastics, all these things that you might think are really fringe issues, but they're all part of the system of capitalism and the lies that we've been sold about you need to have a lot of stuff to make you happy, that we need that the gospel actually challenges, because Jesus, of course, has a lot more to say about mammon and money than it does, for example, about human sexuality.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. And so justice is at the heart of any discussions and any validity of the church and the scripture in our 21st century. Or else we're just making a Jesus of our own making.
Mm-hmm. I mean, ultimately, the cross is meant to be about justice, about setting the world to rights, reconciling us with God, but not in a private one-on-one relationship. But as I said earlier, Revelation 21, making all things new. You compare that to Genesis 2, and all the language that's used is all holistic and global, and it's nature right down to the leaves of the tree, or the trees, as it turns out, of life, are for the healing of the nations. So it's not just about your personal one-on-one. Christianity is not a privatized spirituality, but a very public declaration about the lordship of Christ, to use more, I guess, Christian jargon.
Which is a massive problem for the theologies that so often come out of the pulpits of the West. On the one hand, you've got many good Christian people who want to care about social justice issues, but it's even more radical than we sometimes imagine. The very way we view the world, the way we view money and power and ownership has to change, or else we're screwed. Do you retain hope?
Do I retain hope? Well, Terry Eagleton has a book entitled Hope Without Optimism. And so I guess there's a sense in which, well, theologically you hold on to hope because there's a sense in, doesn't matter how pear-shaped it goes, there will be redemption and renewal. But I get a strong sense that just because, I mean, let's take Romans 8, for example. It says that the whole creation is subject to frustration. And so there's a divine passive in there. It's like God is doing it. And so the path to redemption is through suffering. Romans talks about that for the Christian as well as for the creation. But it doesn't mean that just because Paul can say all things work together for good for those who love him means that all things are good. So you can get to the same point via a bunch of trajectories, I guess, is what I'm saying. And as I would like to choose the one that involves the least suffering for humanity and the creation. And so I'm hopeful of that. Well, we're in for at least the 1.5 degrees of warming that Pacific Island nations lobbied for, so that they don't lose their countries. So we are certainly in for a really rocky ride ahead. We're seeing that now. Anything from the forest fires in Australia last summer and for California now to COVID-19, which is a symptom again of bumping up to nature and destroying habitats and so on. But I'm hopeful that we could see social tipping points where society shifts trajectory. Well, we've seen them before. I take great kind of encouragement from the school strike and Greta Thunberg and all these other things. It's interesting, there was a paper came out earlier this year that talks about social tipping points. I should say a tipping point is a point where a system, whatever it is, goes from one state of being to another relatively rapidly. We've already seen them. I mean, see how we've jumped onto cars, see the great acceleration of the Western economic system, post-World War II, those sorts of things. There are very few farriers around these days, but there's a lot of auto mechanics. But this article said that one of the social tipping points where Christians could be involved in, or church leaders or philosophical leaders or whatever you like, was in demonstrating or encouraging people to see the evils of fossil fuels. Okay, they've delivered us to a point, and now it's time to leave them behind. So there's hope in that. I mean, there's a divestment movement been going for a while now, and where the church can get in. But I also think we've got a lot more to say, because it runs a lot deeper than the greenness or otherwise of our energy generation systems, but the sustainability of our whole way of life. So you see little bits and pieces of that, but then you're coming up against corporate greed and systems in place that do their best to retain control. And, you could talk about policy decisions in various countries and the continued relationship between governments and fossil fuels industries, for example. Those things need to be loosened. But, there's this huge groundswell in many communities. So I guess I'm hopeful that those things continue to trigger a rapid change. And even still, you've got people in banks and economists saying this, and even in the fossil fuel industry itself, that we're at a tipping point that all of a sudden stocks in oil and gas and coal won't have any value anymore. So that may be coming soon. Those sorts of things are rather hard to predict.
Yeah. So how would you respond to someone who's left the church because of its silence on some of these kinds of issues?
Look, I've got a lot of sympathy for that. People leave church for a lot of reasons, partly because or very much because they feel they're pushing against the dominant narrative. I guess the first thing I'd say was, in very, very briefly, we've outlined now an alternative narrative that says this is the sorts of things you can say and think about that feed into the way that you do in a more holistic and integrated sense, that you needn't leave your social conscience behind when you enter church, which seems like a very interesting problem to have. So that's a possibility. There are the other thing is that not all churches have that dichotomy. There are some churches that exist. There's things like the Forest Church movement, which actively embrace that. And I keep promising myself to start doing something about that. So I guess I'd say that I have a lot of sympathy for those who give up on the established church because of that. But that doesn't mean giving up on God or Jesus or the Bible narrative and continuing to maybe deconstruct something that you've inherited, or rethink, or understand that there's another point of view or another way of viewing things.
Yeah.
than
So
what is often spoken about.
So that, I mean, there is deconstruction, reconstruction, both in theology and discovering a church that more suits that kind of broader, holistic understanding of God's work and man's place and humanity's place. I'm not even using gender inclusive language now. Humanity's place, it's. Why do you think the church struggles to believe what seems to be, or not just the church, but very strongly in the church at times, segments of the church have struggled to believe this scientific consensus? And we see it in terms of COVID as well, the same phenomenon.
There's been a real, I mean, how far does this go back? The start of the 20th century, a real retreat of the church from the public sphere. I mean, you had the Enlightenment that said that faith was a private thing and is meant to be kept out of the public sphere. And America, for example, is a really odd case because at one sense it celebrates the separation of church and state, and yet it doesn't. You know, you've got this kind of civil religion that's in its place, and that's a game that's played differently different times in this country as well. You know, Howard, for example, and I don't know quite how to describe the current situation. It's complex, isn't it? And the media have had a field day and a real struggle with a Pentecostal prime minister. But you know, and how to think about him, and all sorts of interesting links, real or imagined, to Hillsong, for example. But yeah, the church has felt that it's been on the retreat for a long time. There's been readings of the Bible, particularly the text we started with, Genesis 1, challenged by the scientific consensus, and then the ways in which the Bible came together and should be viewed, challenged by German scholarship and so on. So there's become a real knee-jerk reaction against science because it seemed like the bogeyman. And if you listen to someone like Richard Dawkins, for example, who's still around, I can't understand why quite, but you know, one of these angry new atheists, and you get this picture that science is just a tool for hitting religion over the head. So I think there's been a sense in which science as a general thing provokes or challenges Christians' worldview of things on a number of levels. But then part of that problem too is not just the theology per se, but the marriage that we've formed with capitalism and modernism and so on. And you see that in the United States again, not picking on my American friends, but there's a real sense of civil religion where there's a resonance developed between capitalism, which treats human beings and the non-human or more than human creation as a means to an end to produce things, and then this kind of end times theology that says, well, the earth doesn't matter because it's just going to be burnt up. And so you get this wonderful thing where people are saying, and this goes back to Reagan even, who did he consult astrologers? There was something weird about it, but you know, he believed that the end of the world was imminent. But instead of that driving him into, I don't know what kind of stance it could have driven him into, but it drove him into, well, Reaganomics was where it drove him to, and burning of fossil fuels and taking Jimmy Carter's solar panels off the White House and all these sorts of things. So they make strange bedfellows, but there's this resonance of ideas that pushes forward. I can't even remember what your question was now. Where are we headed?
I don't know. Just thinking about leadership. There's what's the the movie Johnny English. There's a bishop in one of the Johnny English movies who has a tattoo in a special place, sort of thing, that says something, if Jesus returns, look busy, you know. And there's something about how looking to the future in the right way that ought to shape the present. So if I want to become a grand finalist in a football game of some description, then I will spend hours in the present kicking a ball through a hoop or a goalpost or whatever. And so the future is shaping my present, but in the right kind of way. Whereas what you've just described there by Reagan or whoever is actually a misreading of the future, misshapes our present and destroys a healthy future.
Yeah, there's a few issues. I've remembered the original question now. So there's certainly that, but and historical reasons for bad theology, but there's and it's quite ironic when I just reflect upon what I've just said, because there's a fancy word called which is syncretism, which is kind of like a merger of different ideas or worldviews, and the church is so worried about absorbing green or liberal progressive kind of ideas they think that are antithetical to the Bible, and neglected the fact that the Babylonian captivity of the church really is our comfortableness with our power and our privilege and with capitalism. Even there are even some more progressive churches too that have traditionally been more at home in the environmental space, but because of declining attendance, it's like, oh, we can't focus so much on that because we need to focus on quote unquote the core issues again, which is ensuring our own existence. So anytime you lose, and here's the thing, anytime you lose the servant attitude or approach of the church and focus on self-preservation, then a whole lot of other issues are going to fall off the radar and not receive the focus that they deserve. But I think the church is incredibly fearful of a whole bunch of things, of becoming irrelevant, of science and how it might challenge its worldviews and what it considers to be progressive views that will contaminate the gospel, depending on where you are, particularly the more conservative end of things. And they're all nonsense. It'll not been the case at all. I mean, I, as an evangelical, went back to the Bible and thought, wow, I'm actually surprised there are so many resources in the Bible that support an idea that God actually cares about all that's made.
I've heard it pitched where it's been pitched so that mission and evangelism are set against caring for the environment. So one person that I had a conversation with one time used to work in a game park in southern Africa, and then became a missionary and said, I'm doing a far more important job now than looking after cheetahs and lions in the game park. And I kind of tried to argue a bit with him on it. At the time, I don't think I had a well-framed theology. Do you have how would you have responded to someone like that? Is it an unfair pitching of one thing against another, or is it what's your response to that conversation?
That's a fair question. And look, for some, clearly, I mean, if you accept the body narratives that Paul uses to provide an alternative view of society to the Roman idea of the body, is that everyone has different roles and functions. And look, fine, if you want to be a missionary / evangelist, whatever, you have no business in denigrating the calling of anybody else. It's falling back into Platonicism. In fact, I remember, just as an aside, being an Anglican churchgoer in Sydney, and it was implicit that the highest calling was full-time Christian ministry. And, I wanted to be ordained at the time because I fell into that, and that's probably just not me. And I'm very comfortable with my calling now. So you need to get away from that anyway. But it's a false antithesis. If we accept the fact that the biggest narrative you can draw is the Bible's a story of the trajectory from creation to new creation, and that all things are being renewed, then surely, and the Romans argument that if creation's groaning and birth pains looking forward to the resurrection, then there must be something about resurrected Christians then that means that we'll live in harmony with creation. That the two are intimately tied together. So it's like, if the world's going to be a quote unquote a perfect place in the future, why wouldn't you start living that way now? Paul indeed says, shall I go on sinning so that grace may abound? Oh, not at all, by no means, or maybe figuratively, God forbid. So why not start living the way in which we're going to be then, right now? It's this sense that, again, there's so much thinking that says the goal is going to heaven when you die, and all this stuff that Jesus teaches in the Sermon on the Mount, for example, is just how to get there, rather than what does it mean to be a new creature. So there's that kind of thing. So I think mission can be three things. Or is it two things? Let me think about this. So if I go to a developing world, for example, and I say, okay, I've come to bring you the message of life. I'm going to share the gospel with you, but the land is degraded and people can't feed themselves, and I don't want to do anything about that. Do I really love these people? As you know, as you know, the Bible says, "For God so loved the world," and we're meant to embody that love. So there's that purely on the pragmatic level of James saying that you can wish someone well if you do nothing about it and you've got the means to do. You don't really wish them well, do you? So that's number one.
Can I just make a comment at that point, which is I knew somebody who was working. I'll not mention the specifics of the situation, but they were working in a 2/3 world country, wanting to do Bible translation work, and the community had associated Christianity with what a particular mining company was doing in that region in destroying the local river. And she said to me, I can't, nobody's interested in Bible translation, and they associate Christianity with this evil Western company that's poisoning on their local river. And I said, and she said, well, what do you think I should do? I said, advocate for them, do social justice for them, because nobody's going to be listening to or reading your Bibles anyway, because they haven't seen it as good news yet, And I thought it was classic scenario of obstruction. But you shouldn't just do social justice for the sake of the work that you want to do, kind of thing. But in that situation, it was
So there's actually a phrase, and I know some people contest it and don't think it's entirely applicable, but they call it incarnational mission.
Yes.
So what it means ultimately is that you really do become, the crude phrase is going native. It's a horrible expression, but you adopt the dress, and you learn the language, and you really embody yourself in the people and the concerns that they have, not simply to sell the message, but because you genuinely love them. In another context, I'm involved in a group called Grapplers for Christ. They do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which is a martial art, and so on. And I'm in the community, and I'm there. I love Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I'm obsessed about it. I'm going nuts not being able to roll because of COVID. So I'm not just there, and you would see, and I've seen people like this come into the community and are not committed to the Jiu-Jitsu, but they want to quote unquote share the gospel. People see through that straight away, and it's terrible. And so I guess what I'm saying is that the first reason is that you genuinely love people and you want to care for them best you can, and you think that in one sense, the acme is sharing the gospel with them, but not simply because so their souls can be saved, but so that you might enrich their whole life. John 10:10, I've come that they might have life and have it abundantly. So, quote unquote, missionary work is not independent of caring for people's broader needs, because we're wholes. We're not just a soul in a body, but the soul in the Hebrew worldview is the totality of who you are. It includes your body, right? And then the other, of course, is that it's a matter of justice anyway, which is very tightly tied to the gospel. But then it's also that God has plans for the creation itself. So justice is not just for the human being, which is part of the gospel, but justice for the more than human, the other than human, the greater than human. And it's also part, I think, of the gospel, and the fact that maybe the earth itself, if not all the individual small fairy creatures, which I may be able to cuddle or not, it's not always a good idea, whether they're cute or they're slimy or whatever it is, are my neighbors in a sense as well, precisely because of what we said earlier, that there's two categories, there's creator and creature. And so we share existence together.
So just in closing now, can you think of one take home, maybe a passage of scripture that somebody could go away and read and reflect on with fresh eyes, or a couple of passages that strike you as and what to look for that they maybe have not noticed before?
Okay, I'll give you two really quickly. The first is Psalm 104. So go away and read that psalm, and read it outside if you can, and look around you and look in wonder and awe at everything that you see. And pause and think about the complexity, or you might sit down and read it and then tuck into the latest David Attenborough documentary or something like that. I mean, I think it's important to be connected locally, to be embodied and emplaced. But think about that. So that would be the first one, to orient yourself in that framework of awe, and think about the world around you as creation. The second would be Romans 8. I don't know, that's a passage you've talked about, and meditate upon the idea that the whole creation groans in birth pains. And it's worth noting too, in his first century context, Paul could see, why there was a viaduct into Rome. An aqueduct, because you couldn't drink from the Tiber River because it was polluted, or the quality of the air in any city in the ancient world, particularly Rome, the air quality, or all these other things. It wasn't, when Paul says creation groans in birth pains, he wasn't being poetic, he was being quite literal. You could see that. You can see the damage that any empire does. Whole species were lost, or their ranges greatly diminished because of the entertainment of the Roman circus. So read that passage and think about the groaning of creation and birth pains, and then watch the news about environmental destruction, about the fires, the literal cries that the beekeepers in New South Wales would have heard when they went to forest to check on their apiaries and heard creatures screaming in pain from the bushfires. When you think about ocean acidification, when you see that picture, and you talked about it earlier, of dead birds, seabirds, and in the cavity of their rib cage filled with plastic. Think about all these things and feel that pain. There's a room in Christian living and theology for lamentation, for weeping, for thinking about what we've done to the planet, and just being distraught and overwhelmed for a period of time, and sit in that pain and think about, what can I do to ease that suffering? The beauty that I've meditated upon through the lens of Psalm 104, and then the pain of Romans 8 and the promise of resurrection, and think that, as you said earlier, the light of the future shines into the present. What changes can we make? And if the resurrection is some great revolution that God set up, that began in the cross, and it culminates then, how can I be part of that revolution now?
Wonderful,
in whatever way it might be.
Wonderful note to end on. I without adding too much to that, it strikes me there's a phrase that Jesus uses in the Sermon on the Mount: consider the lilies, consider the birds of the air. And it's a word of study, look at diligently, carefully reflect upon, see what it's saying. That's the text for me. And of course, growing up, I've always thought that was so very nice: smell the flowers, smell the daisies, sort of thing. But after what you've just said, it could probably just mean so much more in terms of both the hope and the despair. Well, not despair, but certainly the larger laments that we need to participate in, that we try to avoid. We want to be creatures of comfort. And great sections of scripture to reflect on. You've been listening to Dchurched.com. Thanks for listening or watching on our channel. I've been talking to Dr. Mick Pope, and my name's Jules. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and like our podcast, or if you're watching this on YouTube, to do likewise. See you again soon. Bye-bye for now.